Deep beneath the jagged, frost-bitten peaks of the Black Needle Mountains lies the Acheron facility, a labyrinth of cold steel and humming superconductors designed to peer into the very marrow of existence. Here, the world's most brilliant minds, or perhaps its most arrogant, sought to weigh the invisible. They were hunting for dark matter, that elusive ghost glue that holds galaxies together. But in Eldermurk, the shadows you hunt often have eyes of their own, and the deeper you dig into the void, the more the void begins to dig into you. Dr. Aris Thorne stood before the primary aperture, his reflection ghost-like in the reinforced obsidian glass. He was a man aged not by years, but by equations that refused to balance. Beside him, the large hadron shunt vibrated with a low, bone-deep thrum that seemed to vibrate the very soul. They were seconds away from the Obsidian Protocol, a high-energy collision designed to tear a microscopic thinning in the fabric of space-time, just enough to catch a glimpse of the dark particles flowing through the veins of the universe. "Stability is at 98%, Doctor," whispered Sarah Vance, the lead technician. Her voice was thin, brittle as dry parchment. But the gravitational sensors, they are behaving erratically. It's as if the mountain itself is holding its breath. Thorne didn't look away from the monitors. "The Black Needle has always been a place of strange echoes, Sarah. Focus on the readings. If we capture the signature of the dark sector today, we rewrite every book ever written. We move from being children playing in the dirt to masters of the cosmic fire." He reached out and engaged the final sequence. The hum escalated into a shriek, not machinery, but reality itself being stretched too thin. On the screens, the visualizers didn't show the expected scatter of subatomic debris. Instead, they showed a perfect, terrifying circle of absolute nothingness. It wasn't black. It was a lack of color, a hole in the visual spectrum that hurt the eyes to behold. Total energy collapse. Vance screamed over the rising roar. "The shunt isn't drawing power anymore. Doctor, it's leaking it. Something on the other side is pulling." Then came the silence. It was sudden, heavy, and suffocating. The air in the chamber turned metallic, tasting of ozone and ancient copper. The microscopic thinning they had hoped for had not remained microscopic. The aperture had shattered. In its place hung a shimmering veil, a doorway draped in folding geometries that defied human perspective. It was a portal, jagged and raw, bleeding a cold, violet light into the sterile laboratory. Thorne stepped forward, driven by a fatal curiosity that had claimed many a man in the history of Eldermurk. He looked through the veil. He didn't see a void. He saw a city. It was a metropolis of impossible spires, constructed from material that looked like frozen smoke and liquid mercury. The sky above it was a bruised emerald, torn by 3 moons that seemed too large for any sane orbit. And standing at the base of the portal, on the other side of the shimmering threshold, was a figure. It was tall, draped in robes that shifted like the surface of an oil slick, its face a mask of polished silver with a single, burning vertical slit for an eye. There was no sound, but a voice echoed directly into Thorne's mind, a cold, symphonic resonance that carried the weight of a billion years. "The harvest has been delayed for too long," the voice vibrated. "You have built the bridge, little architect. We thank you for the invitation." Panic erupted. Security alarms wailed, their red strobes clashing with the violet glow of the portal. Thorne realized with a sickening jolt in his gut that this wasn't an accidental discovery. This was a beckoning. The dark matter they had been tracking wasn't just inert mass. It was the exhaust of a civilization so advanced it used the fundamental forces of the universe as its plumbing. And now, they had knocked on the front door. "Seal it! Seal the chamber!" Thorne yelled, stumbling back. "We can't!" Vance cried, her hands flying over a console that was melting before her eyes. "The portal is self-sustaining. It's feeding on the Earth's own magnetic field. Doctor, they're coming through. From the Emerald City, more figures appeared. Not soldiers, but harvesters. They didn't carry guns. They carried rods of humming light that made the air around them crystallize. As the first silver-masked entity stepped through the veil, the temperature in the room plummeted to sub-zero. The floor beneath its feet cracked as the molecular bonds of the concrete simply gave up. Thorne knew then that conventional weapons would be like throwing pebbles at a hurricane. He turned and ran toward the emergency bulkhead, dragging a dazed Sarah Vance with him. They had to reach the surface. They had to activate the Pale Horizon, the secret contingency plan that the world's governments had whispered about in bunkers for decades. A plan so horrific it was considered a crime against humanity to even think of it. The Pale Horizon wasn't a weapon to kill the invaders. It was a plan to hide the world. As they burst through the secondary airlock, Thorne looked back one last time. The silver figure had raised its hand, and the laboratory staff, the janitors, the junior physicists, the guards, were not being killed. They were being dismantled. Their atoms were being pulled apart like threads from an old sweater, swirling into a glowing vortex to be consumed. The invaders weren't here to rule. They were here to recycle. They reached the elevator, the ascent feeling like an eternity. Outside, the Black Needle Mountains were being engulfed by a localized storm of violet lightning. The sky was bruising. The first contact had been made, and it was a death sentence. "Sarah, listen to me," Thorne said, his voice trembling as the elevator doors groaned open at the mountain's peak. The Pale Horizon requires 3 keys. One is held by the Chancellor in the Citadel of Oakhaven. The second is lost in the sunken archive of the Grey Marshes. And the third... He reached into his vest and pulled out a small, pulsing crystal encased in lead-lined brass. The third is right here. Vance looked at the crystal, then at the horizon where the emerald sky was beginning to spill over mountain peaks like a slow-moving poison. "What does it do, Aris? What is the plan?" Thorne looked at her with eyes full of tears and a terrifying resolve. "It doesn't fight them. It shifts us. It pushes our entire reality 5 degrees out of phase with the rest of the universe. We will be ghosts in our own world. Sarah, they won't be able to touch us, but we won't be able to touch anything either. We will live in a world of shadows, forever watching a sun that can no longer warm us." "It's a prison," she whispered. "No." Thorne replied as the first of the silver-masked harvesters crested the ridge of the mountain, floating inches above the snow. "It's a hiding spot, and right now, it's the only way to keep the human race from being erased from the ledger of existence." The silver figure pointed its rod at them. The air began to hum that terrible, dismantling tune. Thorne grabbed Vance's hand and ran toward the waiting VTOL transport. The race for the other 2 keys had begun. Eldermurk was no longer just a land of myths and shadows. It was a final battlefield for a world that was about to be turned into a ghost. The VTOL roared over the jagged spine of the Black Needle Mountains, its engine straining against a wind that shouldn't exist. Behind them, the peak of the mountain was no longer a solid mass of rock. It had become a beacon of twisting violet light, a jagged wound in the atmosphere that pulsed like a dying heart. From the cockpit, Sarah Vance watched as the emerald stain in the sky began to spread, devouring the familiar stars of Eldermurk and replacing them with the cold, alien constellations of a realm that had waited eons to return. "The satellite relays are going dark," Sarah shouted over the mechanical scream of the transport. She pointed at a flickering terminal. "It's not just a mountain. They are deploying dampener spires across the continent. London, Tokyo, New York, they're reporting the same violet mists. Our communication is being strangled." Dr. Aris Thorne gripped the lead line case containing the first key. His knuckles were white. "They are isolating us, like a shepherd fencing in the flock before the slaughter. They don't want us calling out to each other. They want the harvest to be orderly. The plan, the pale horizon, felt like a heavy curse in Thorne's mind. To save humanity, they had to surrender their tangibility. They had to become the very shadows that Eldermurk was famous for. But first, they had to survive the journey to Oakhaven. As they crossed the Iron Valleys, the horror of the invasion became visible on a scale Thorne hadn't dared to imagine. Below them, a small mining village was being processed. There were no explosions, no fire, no screams of traditional warfare. There was only a terrifying, rhythmic hum. Silver-masked figures glided through the streets like ghosts. Wherever their light touched, buildings didn't collapse. They unraveled. Stone turned to dust, metal turned to vapor, and the people... Thorne looked away as he saw a line of villagers being drawn upward into a swirling vortex, their bodies shimmering and dissolving into raw data and energy. "They aren't just taking resources," Sarah whispered, her face pressed against the glass. "They are taking the information. Every memory, every strand of DNA, every history. They're deleting us and storing the files." Suddenly, the VTOL shuddered. A spear of solidified light hummed past their wing, missing them by inches. An interceptor drone, a geometric shape made of shifting plates and glowing veins, was closing in on them. It moved with a grace that mocked the laws of aerodynamics. "Hold on," the pilot yelled, but it was too late. The drone emitted a pulse of 0-point frequency. The VTOL's electronics died instantly. The humming engine sputtered into a hollow silence. For a moment, they hung in the air, weightless and doomed, before gravity reclaimed them. They spiraled down toward the outskirts of the Whisperwood, the ancient, sentient forest that bordered the road to Oakhaven. The crash was a symphony of tearing metal and snapping ancient timber. When Thorne opened his eyes, the world was a blur of smoke and moonlight. The VTOL lay in ruins, its hull cracked open like an egg. Sarah was slumped against a bulkhead, blood trickling from a cut on her forehead, but she was breathing. The pilot was gone, vaporized by the drone's final beam just before they hit the trees. Thorne crawled out of the wreckage, clutching the lead line case. The Whisperwood lived up to its name. The trees here were old, their bark etched with runes from a time before the Great Cataclysm. They seemed to groan in the presence of the alien violet light above. But the forest was also a shield. Its dense canopy and strange magnetic properties made it difficult for the invaders' sensors to penetrate. "Sarah, wake up," Thorne hissed, shaking her shoulder. She gasped, her eyes snapping open. "The drone, did it find us?" "Not yet, but they'll track the crash site soon. We have to move. Oakhaven is 20 miles to the east through these woods. If we stay on the main roads, the harvesters will find us in minutes." They began a trek through the undergrowth. The forest felt different tonight. The shadows seemed longer, thicker. Eldermurk had always been a place where the veil between worlds was thin, and now that the portal was open, the local spirits and ancient entities of the woods were restless. Strange, bioluminescent eyes watched them from the hollows of trees, and the wind carried voices that sounded like 1,000 whispered secrets. "Do you think the Chancellor still has the second key?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. "Oakhaven is a fortress, but against them... The Chancellor is a man who prepares for the end of the world every Tuesday," Thorne replied, though his own confidence was wavering. "The Citadel is shielded against extra-dimensional incursions. It was built on a ley line intersection. If there's one place on Earth that can resist a harvest, it's there." As they reached a clearing, they stopped dead. In the center of the grove stood a harvester. It was alone, its silver mask reflecting the bruised emerald sky. It wasn't looking for them. It was standing over an ancient stone altar, its rod of light hovering over the mossy surface. The alien turned its head, a smooth, sickeningly fluid motion. The single vertical slit of its eye glowed with an intense heat. Information detected. The voice resonated in their minds. cold and clinical. Anomalous signature. The architect. You carry the spark of the fade. Run. Thorne yelled. The harvester didn't move fast. It didn't need to. It simply folded space. One moment it was 50 feet away. The next, it was 10 feet in front of them. Thorne felt a molecular pull, the terrifying sensation that his skin was about to unbind from his bones. But then, the Whisperwood fought back. The ground erupted as massive, gnarled roots, glowing with an ancient, earthy gold light, surged upward. They wrapped around the harvester's legs and torso, pinning it to the spot. The alien's rod of light lashed out, vaporizing the wood, but more roots took their place. The forest, a creature of Eldermurk's own dark magic, recognized the invaders as a virus, a force that sought to turn its ancient complexity into simple, harvestable energy. The trees, they're helping us? Sarah gasped. No, Thorne said, pulling her toward the tree line. They're protecting themselves, but it gives us a chance. Go! They ran as the forest behind them became a battlefield of light and wood. The screams of the aliens' frequency clashed with the deep, tectonic roars of the earth. Thorne knew this was only a temporary distraction. The invaders were a Type 2 civilization. They would eventually learn to dismantle the forest magic, just as they dismantle human steel. As dawn broke, a sickly, violet-tinted dawn, the spires of Oakhaven finally appeared on the horizon. The citadel was surrounded by a shimmering blue dome of energy, a desperate shield held together by the last of the world's ancient knowledge and modern science. But even as they approached the gates, Thorne saw something that made his heart sink. Hanging in the sky above the citadel was a void carrier, a ship the size of a city, shaped like a hollowed-out diamond, slowly descending toward the shield. The harvest of Oakhaven was about to begin. We're too late, Sarah whispered. We're too late, Sarah whispered. No, Thorne said, clutching the case. The pale horizon doesn't need the world to be standing. It just needs the keys to be turned. We get inside, find the Chancellor, and we end this, one way or another. The blue energy dome over Oakhaven groaned under the weight of the void carrier. It looked like a giant, dark diamond pressing down on a soap bubble. Every time the alien ship emitted a pulse, the shimmering shield rippled, casting long, distorted shadows across the valley. Thorne and Sarah reached the outer perimeter, with a last guard, a desperate mix of armored soldiers and robed scholars, stood watch behind makeshift barricades. Identification! A guard barked, his rifle shaking. He wasn't looking at them. His eyes were fixed on the sky, watching the diamond-shaped ship slowly turn the clouds into violet steam. Dr. Aris Thorne, I have the Black Needle Protocol. Thorne shouted, holding the lead line case above his head. The mention of the protocol acted like a magic word. The heavy iron gates hissed open, and they were ushered into the frantic streets of Oakhaven. The city, usually a place of quiet study in ancient architecture, was in chaos. People were weeping in the streets, holding on to relics and old books as if paper could shield them from a civilization that harvested stars. They were led toward the central spire, a tower that predated the city itself. Its stones were blacker than night, etched with the same shimmering rhymes Thorne had seen in the Whisperwood. Inside, the air was cool and smelled of incense and ozone. The Chancellor was waiting for them in the map room, standing over a holographic projection of the world that was rapidly turning green, the color of the invaders' influence. Thorne, the Chancellor said, his voice a gravelly rasp. He looked tired, his ceremonial robe singed at the edges. I watched your mountain fall on the monitors. I assumed you were Stardust by now. Not yet, Thorne replied, placing the case on the stone table. But if we don't act, we'll all be nothing more than a memory in an alien database. I have the first key. Do you have the second? The Chancellor sighed and reached into a hidden compartment beneath the table. He pulled out a cylinder of translucent obsidian. Inside, a core of white light spiraled like a miniature galaxy. This was the heart of Oakhaven, the second key to the Pale Horizon. It's powered by the ley lines beneath this tower, the Chancellor explained. But the void carrier above is draining the Earth's marrow. The shield will fail in less than an hour. And even if we have these two, the third key is problematic. Sarah stepped forward. The sunken archive. The Grey Marshes. We know it's there. The Chancellor looked at her with pity. The Grey Marshes are no longer just a swamp, child. The invaders have deployed a temporal anchor there. They are folding time in that region to study the archive's ancient secrets at an accelerated rate. To enter the marshes now is to walk into a place where a minute could be a century or a second could be an eternity. Thorne gripped the table. We don't have a choice. The Pale Horizon requires all three keys to be turned simultaneously at the World Anchor site. If we don't get that third key, the plan is just a ghost story. Suddenly, the tower shook with a deafening roar. The holographic map flickered and died. A deep, resonant chime echoed through the city, the sound of the energy dome finally shattering. They are inside the perimeter, the Chancellor whispered, through the high windows of the spire. Thorne saw the silver-masked harvesters descending from the diamond ship. They didn't land. They simply drifted down like feathers made of mercury. As they touched the ground, the dismantling began. The beautiful, ancient libraries of Oakhaven started to dissolve into glowing streams of light, flowing upward toward the void carrier. Go, the Chancellor commanded, handing Thorne the second key. My guards have a specialized submersible skiff hidden in the lower vaults. It's shielded against temporal fluctuations. It's our only prototype. It can take you through the marshes to the archive. What about you? Sarah asked. The Chancellor straightened his robes, a grim smile touching his lips. I am the Chancellor of Oakhaven. I will stay and give these harvesters a lesson in history they won't forget. I will overload the ley line core. It won't kill them, but it will buy you the time you need to reach the marshes. Thorne and Sarah didn't argue. They took the two keys and ran for the lower vaults. As they descended the spiral staircase, they heard the first alien voices echoing the halls above. That cold, symphonic resonance that made the blood run cold. The archive is a priority. Secure the architect. The fade must not be triggered. They know, Sarah panted. They know about the Pale Horizon. Of course they do, Thorne said, his boots clattering on the stone. They've probably harvested 1,000 worlds that tried the same thing. But they haven't harvested Eldermurk yet. Our physics are messier than they're used to. They reached the vault and found the skiff, a sleek, needle-like craft made of lead and enchanted silver. Two guards stood by, their faces grim. They helped Thorne and Sarah into the cramped cockpit. The Grey Marshes are 500 miles to the south, one guard said, his hand on the launch lever. With the temporal drive, you'll be there in 20 minutes, but for the rest of the world, it might be 20 hours, or 20 years. Godspeed. The lever was pulled. The skiff shot into a darkened tunnel, fueled by a burst of raw ley line energy. As they emerged from the mountainside into the open air, a massive explosion rocked the city behind them. The central spire erupted in a pillar of pure, blinding white light. The Chancellor's final act. The void carrier above Oakhaven tilted, its silver hull blackened by the magical surge. He did it, Sarah whispered, looking back at the rising smoke. He bought us a ticket to the end of the world. Thorne replied, his eyes fixed on the horizon. In front of them, the landscape began to blur. The green forests and brown hills of Eldermurk were replaced by a thick, swirling fog of gray and violet. The clocks on the skiff's dashboard began to spin wildly. forward, then backward, then stopping altogether. The air outside the reinforced glass became thick, moving like liquid. They had entered the Grey Marshes. Here, the sky was a static-filled void, and the very ground beneath the water was made of shifting memories. Somewhere in this temporal soup was a sunken archive, and within it, the final piece of the puzzle. But as the skiff slowed, Thorne saw something on the sonar that made his breath catch. There were other ships in the marsh, not alien ones. Human ships from different eras. A Victorian steam vessel, a Cold War submarine, and a futuristic scout craft, all trapped in the same temporal pocket, frozen in various states of decay. "We aren't the first ones to look for the third key," Thorne said, his voice a ghost of itself. "And look at the shore, Sarah." On the muddy banks of the marsh, hundreds of silver-mast harvesters stood perfectly still, like statues. They weren't moving because, in this pocket of time, they had already been there for 1,000 years, waiting for the skiff to arrive. The trap was set. The skiff's engines groaned as the temporal thickness of the marshes began to solidify around them. Outside, the water wasn't liquid. It was a shimmering, viscous mercury that reflected skies from a dozen different epochs. One moment, the horizon showed a burning sun. The next, a frozen wasteland under a dead moon. Sarah gripped the console, her knuckles white as she watched the chronometer on her wrist melt into a useless puddle of metal. "Thorne, the sensor array is picking up heartbeats," she whispered, her voice sounding strangely layered, as if she were speaking from 3 different distances at once. "But they're slow, 1 beat every 10 minutes. "That's the temporal anchor's effect," Thorne replied, adjusting the lead shielding on the 2 keys they already possessed. "The invaders haven't just occupied the space. They've turned it into a static museum. Those harvesters on the shore, they aren't frozen. They're moving at a speed so high that to us, they appear as statues. If we step out of this shielded skiff without the right frequency, we'll be dismantled before we can even blink." The skiff bumped against a submerged structure, the roof of the sunken archive, once a glorious library of Eldermurk's forbidden history. It now sat drowned in the shifting silt of time. Only the topmost spire, a jagged needle of verdigris-covered bronze, broke the surface of the marsh. "We have to go down," Thorne said, pointing to a circular airlock near the spire's tip. "The third key, the Aeon Gear, is kept in the deep chronometry vault. It's the only part of the archive designed to remain stable regardless of what happens to the timeline outside." They donned their specialized Aegis suits, clunky, pressurized garments lined with the same enchanted silver as a skiff. Stepping out into the marsh air felt like walking through invisible cobwebs. Every movement required immense effort, as if the air itself were resisting their presence. As they reached the airlock, Sarah looked back at the shore. One of the silver-mast harvesters had tilted its head, only a fraction of a millimeter, but it was moving. It was adapting to their speed. "They're sinking with us," Sarah gasped. "Thorne, hurry." They tumbled into the airlock and slammed the lever. Inside the archive, the atmosphere was hauntingly still. Dust motes hung in the air like stars, perfectly motionless. The walls were lined with thousands of scrolls and books, but as Thorne reached out to touch one, it crumbled into fine gray ash. "Everything here has already lived its full life," Thorne noted grimly. "We are walking through a corpse of a building." They descended a spiraling staircase that seemed to stretch and contract with every step. As they reached the lower levels, the temporal hum grew louder, a sound like 1 billion ticking clocks layered over one another. This was the heart of the anchor. In the center of the deep chronometry vault stood a massive, transparent sphere. Suspended inside was a third key, the Aeon Gear. It didn't look like a gear. It was a shifting fractal of golden light, constantly rearranging its shape to represent every second that had ever passed. But they weren't alone. Standing before the sphere was a figure that was not a harvester. It was human, or it had been once. It wore a tattered lab coat from the Acheron facility, but its skin was translucent, showing gears and glowing violet wires beneath the surface. Dr. Vane? Thorne breathed, recognizing his old mentor who had disappeared in a laboratory accident 10 years ago. The figure turned. Its eyes were hollow pits of violet light. When it spoke, the voice didn't come from its mouth, but from the walls themselves. Aris, you have come to complete the circuit. The architects of the Emerald City were pleased with your progress. They knew you would seek the Pale Horizon. They turned you into an interface, Thorne said, his horror rising. They used your mind to map our history. History is just data to be sorted, Aris, the Vane entity replied, stepping toward them. Its movements were jerky, skipping frames like a corrupted video file. The Pale Horizon is not a hiding spot. It is a refinement process. By shifting your reality, you are simply concentrating the energy for a more efficient harvest. They wanted you to find the keys. They wanted you to turn the world into a ghost, because ghosts are easier to store. Sarah leveled her pulse pistol at the entity. He's lying. He has to be. The Chancellor wouldn't have died for a lie. Is he? Thorne looked at the Aeon Gear. Think about it, Sarah. If we shift the world out of phase, we become pure energy. We lose our physical defense. We become exactly what they want. A condensed, stable battery of souls. The Vane entity tilted its head, mimicking the harvesters. The choice is yours, Architect. Stay and be dismantled atom by atom in the green fire, or turn the keys and become a permanent part of our collection. Either way, the harvest is inevitable. Suddenly, the vault walls groaned. The harvesters from the shore had arrived. They were tearing through the bronze hull of the archive like it was wet paper. The violet light of their rods began to bleed into the room, turning the dust motes into tiny, burning embers. Thorne, what do we do? Sarah cried, her pistol shaking. If we don't take the key, they kill us now. If we do, we might be walking into their trap. Thorne looked at the first 2 keys in his case, then at the shifting fractal of the Aeon Gear. He saw a pattern he hadn't noticed before. The keys weren't just switches. They were anchors. They think they've mapped every outcome, Thorne whispered, a spark of Eldermurk's chaotic defiance lighting up his eyes. But they don't understand the Black Needle paradox. We aren't going to shift the world away from them. We're going to shift the portal into itself. He smashed the glass of the sphere with the butt of his case. As his hand closed around the Aeon Gear, time in the vault went into a violent spasm. Sarah, grab the gear. We're not going to Oakhaven's world anchor. We're going back to where it all started. The Vane entity let out a screech of pure static as the temporal stability of the vault collapsed. The harvesters froze as the Aeon Gear began to drain the energy of their own temporal anchor. Where? Sarah screamed over the roar of the timeline shattering. The Black Needle. Thorne yelled, we're going to use the portal to feed them their own harvest. As the archive began to implode into a singularity of gray mud and golden light, Thorne activated the skiff's remote recall. They were pulled upward out of the drowning library and back into Mercury waters. But as they broke the surface, they saw the void carrier hovering directly above them, its massive diamond hull opening like a hungry mouth. The invaders were done waiting. The skiff breached the surface of the Grey Marshes with a violent jolt, water and time sludge cascading off its silver hull. Above them, the sky was gone. It had been replaced by the underside of the void carrier, a landscape of shifting obsidian plates and humming energy conduits that stretched from horizon to horizon. A beam of pulsating green light, the tractor pulse, struck the water around them, turning the mercury-like liquid into boiling steam. They're locking on. Sarah screamed, her hands dancing over the skiff's flickering controls. The temporal drive is fried from the Aeon Gear surge. We're sitting ducks. Not yet, Thorne growled. He clutched the 3 keys, the lead line cylinder, the obsidian spire, and the glowing fractal of the Aeon Gear. Together, they vibrated with a frequency that made his teeth ache. The gear is still draining the Marshes' energy. Redirect the overflow into the emergency thrusters. We don't need a temporal jump. We need raw kinetic speed. Sarah didn't hesitate. She bypassed the safety limiters, her fingers moving with the desperation of someone who had seen the end of the world and refused to accept it. The skiff groaned, its frame vibrating as the stolen energy of 1,000 years was funneled into its engines. With a crack like a thunderbolt, the skiff ignited, lashing out across the water at a speed that blurred the world into a streak of gray and violet. They shot out from under the void carrier just as the tractor pulse slammed into the spot where they'd been, vaporizing a square mile of the marsh instantly. Behind them, the diamond-shaped city ship began to tilt, its massive engines igniting with a sound that felt like the Earth's crust was being torn apart. It was pursuing them, heading for the Black Needle. Thorne shouted, "We have to beat them to the primary aperture. If they reach it first, they'll stabilize the bridge and the harvest becomes permanent. But if we reach it, we can invert the polarity." Aris, the vein entity, said the pale horizon was a trap. Sarah yelled over the roar of the wind. "How do we know the inversion isn't exactly what they want?" "Because they are chasing us." Thorne pointed at the sensors. "If they wanted us to succeed, they'd let us go. They realize that I'm not using the keys to hide. I'm using the Aeon Gear to create a feedback loop. We're going to feed the energy of their own harvest back into the portal. We're going to turn their vacuum cleaner into a leaf blower." As they crossed the Iron Valleys once more, the scale of the devastation was heartbreaking. The violet mist had thickened, and the emerald sky now dominated the zenith. The processed zones were growing. Cities that had stood for centuries were now shimmering plains of dust. But as the skiff tore through the air, Thorne noticed something strange. Small pockets of resistance were appearing. In the ruins of Oakhaven, the survivors were using the remnants of the ley line energy to fire beams of white light at the hovering interceptor drones. In the Whisperwood, the forest had grown a mile in height, its gnarled branches swatting at the silver-masked harvesters. Eldermurk was a dark land, but it was a living land, and it was fighting the dematerialization with every ounce of its ancient, messy magic. "Look," Sarah pointed ahead. The Black Needle Mountains were visible, but they were no longer just mountains. They had been transformed. The invaders had built a massive, processing spire around the peak, a lattice of white hot metal that funneled the energy from the portal into a beam directed straight at the void carrier. "They're already using the portal to fuel the ship," Sarah said, her voice dropping in horror. "We can't get close. That spire is protected by a zero-point field. The Aeon Gear is the key to that field," Thorne said, his eyes fixed on the target. "It's the only thing that can synchronize with their clock. Sarah, I need you to take the controls. I'm going to the external hatch." "Are you insane?" "At this speed, if I don't manually align the gear's resonance with the spire's pulse, we'll hit that field and turn into a smear of atoms. Just keep us steady." Thorne climbed into the small, pressurized crawl space and cracked the hatch. The wind was a solid wall of ice and ozone. Below him, the ground was a blur of violet-stained snow. He looked up at the processing spire. It was beautiful in a terrifying way, a monument to a civilization that saw the universe as nothing more than a series of numbers to be crunched. He held the Aeon Gear out. The fractal began to spin, its golden light clashing with the violet energy of the spire. Thorne felt the pull of the zero-point field, a cold, numbing sensation that tried to stop his heart. He began to chant the calculus of chaos, the forbidden equations he had discovered in the sunken archive. "Now, Sarah, punch it." The skiff accelerated again, its silver hull glowing red-hot. They hit the 0-point field. For a second, time stopped. Thorne saw his own life flashing before him, not as memories, but as a series of frozen frames. He saw the Harvester's homeworld, a place of cold, perfect order where nothing ever died because nothing was ever truly alive. With a scream of defiance, Thorne slammed the Aeon Gear against the skiff's internal conduit. The field shattered. The skiff punched through the barrier like a needle through silk, soaring directly into the open hangar of the processing spire. They crash-landed on a platform of shimmering liquid metal, the skiff tumbling and spinning until it came to a rest inches from a vertical drop into a pit of pure, raw energy. Thorne crawled from the wreckage, blood masking his face, but the 3 keys were still in his grasp. Sarah emerged behind him, her pulse pistol drawn. They were in the heart of the machine. Above them, the portal hung like a great, bleeding eye, and standing on the central bridge waiting for them were 3 high harvesters, their silver masks etched with gold, their presence so heavy it made the air feel like lead. The architect returns, the collective voice boomed, echoing not just in their minds, but through the very metal of the spire. You have brought the keys to your own tomb. Place them in the altar, and the transition will be painless. Thorne looked at Sarah, then at the keys. He could feel the void carrier closing outside, its shadow engulfing the mountain. He smiled, a bloody, desperate grin. I have a better idea, Thorne said. How about we see what happens when you try to harvest the paradox? He didn't head for the altar. He ran toward the primary aperture's cooling vent. Stop him, the harvesters hissed. The interior of the processing spire was a nightmare of non-Euclidean geometry. Walkways shifted like liquid mercury, and the walls pulsed with rhythmic, sickly green light that matched the heartbeat of the void carrier hovering outside. Thorne sprinted toward the cooling vent of the primary aperture, his boots clattering against the metallic floor. Behind him, Sarah fired her pulse pistol, the blue bolts of energy splashing harmlessly against the shimmering shields of the high harvesters. Resistance is an inefficient use of biological energy, the harvesters intoned. They didn't run. They glided, their silver robes trailing behind them like smoke. With a flick of metallic finger, one of the entities sent a wave of gravity towards Sarah, throwing her against a bulkhead. Sarah, Thorne yelled, pausing for a fraction of a second. Keep going, she gasped, struggling to stand as the air around her began to crystallize into a containment cell. Focus on the aperture. I'll buy you the seconds. Thorne reached the edge of the cooling vent, a massive, circular pit that descended into the white-hot core of the mountain. Far below, the portal's anchor was visible, a spinning ring of singularities that generated the bridge to the Emerald City. The heat was immense, singing his eyebrows and making the lead line case in his hand almost too hot to hold. He pulled the 3 keys out. The lead line cylinder, the obsidian spire, and the Aeon Gear began pulled toward each other, drawn by an irresistible magnetic force. You want the data? Thorne screamed at the approaching harvesters. You want the sum total of Eldermurk's history? Here is a lesson in irrationality. He didn't place the keys into the altar as the invaders expected. Instead, he forced the Aeon Gear inside the obsidian spire, grinding the light fractal against the dark stone. A screech of metaphysical protest echoed through the chamber. The keys began to bleed a chaotic, rainbow-colored light, a spectrum that didn't exist in the Harvester's perfect, ordered universe. System error. A voice whispered, not the Harvesters, but the spire itself. Anomalous input detected. Logic loop failing. The high Harvesters froze. For the first time, Thorne saw something akin to hesitation in their silver masks. Their movements became jerky, their forms flickering between different points in space as the Aeon Gear began to scramble the local timeline. The pale horizon was designed to shift us out of phase, Thorne shouted, holding the fuse keys over the vent. "But if I drop these into the core, they won't shift humanity. They'll shift the portal's destination. I'm rerouting your bridge from Earth to the center of a collapsing black hole. You would destroy yourself." The lead harvester vibrated, its voice losing its symphonic quality and becoming a harsh, metallic rasp. "The feedback would erase this mountain, this continent, and your very soul. We are eternal. You are a flicker. Eldermurk is a land of flickers," Thorne replied, his eyes burning with feverish light. "And sometimes, a flicker is enough to start a fire that burns down a palace." He let go. The fuse keys tumbled into the white-hot abyss. Time seemed to stretch as they fell. Thorne watched as the rainbow light of the paradox hit the singularity at the bottom of the vent. The reaction was instantaneous. The green light of the spire turned to violent, screaming white. The rhythmic hum of the void carrier outside transformed into a high-pitched wail of shearing metal. The portal above them didn't close. It began to turn inside out. The emerald sky of the alien dimension was sucked back into the aperture, replaced by a terrifying view of a crushing, infinite darkness, the maw of a distant singularity. "The inversion is working," Sarah cried, the gravity cell around her shattering as the spire's power was redirected. But the High Harvesters were not defeated yet. Enraged by the loss of their harvest, they converged on Thorne. Their rods of light were no longer tools for dismantling. They were blades of pure, destructive frequency. "If we go, you go with us," the lead harvester shrieked. Thorne backed away toward the edge of the pit, but he was trapped. The floor beneath him began to dissolve as the spire's structural integrity failed. Just as the harvester raised its blade for the final strike, a massive tremor shook the mountain. The Black Needle itself was fighting back. The ancient stones, imbued with eons of Eldermurk's chaotic magic, surged through the invaders' machinery. Gnarled, stone-like protrusions erupted from the floor, impaling the harvesters and tearing through their silver robes. The mountain was reclaiming its peak. "Thorne, the skiff," Sarah yelled, pointing toward the battered silver craft. The hangar was collapsing. Shards of obsidian and liquid metal fell like rain. Thorne dived across the shifting floor, grabbing Sarah's hand as they scrambled back into the ruins of the VTOL skiff. "We don't have enough power to fly." Sarah screamed as she slammed the hatch. "We don't need to fly," Thorne said, his hands blurring over the remaining manual overrides. "We just need to fall in the right direction. The portal is creating a massive gravitational pull. If I can sync our hull to the repulsion frequency of the mountain, we'll be spat out like a seed from a fruit." Outside, the void carrier was being torn apart. The massive diamond ship was being pulled toward the mountain peak, its hull buckling and snapping under the weight of the inverted portal. It was a spectacle of cosmic destruction, a Type 2 civilization being devoured by the very hole they had dug. Thorne hit the pulse eject button. The skiff didn't fly. It was launched by a tectonic surge of energy. They were thrown to the hangar wall, soaring through a sky filled with violet lightning and falling debris. Behind them, the processing spire exploded in a shock wave of white light that leveled the top of the Black Needle Mountain. The portal collapsed into a single, silent point of light before vanishing entirely. The skiff tumbled through the air, spinning out of control toward the snowy valleys below. Inside, Thorne and Sarah were thrown against the walls, the world a chaotic blur of white and black. Then, with a final, bone-jarring thud, the skiff hit a deep drift of snow and went still. Silence returned to Eldermurk. Thorne pushed open the den hatch and crawled out into the cold, crisp air. The sky was no longer emerald. The violet mists were fading, leaving behind the familiar, cold stars of their own world. The moon shone down on the Black Needle, which now stood as a jagged, broken stump against the horizon. Sarah climbed out beside him, shivering. "Is it over? Did we win?" Thorne looked at the mountain. then at the glowing embers falling from the sky. The portal is closed. The void carrier is gone. But we aren't the same world we were yesterday, Sarah. He looked at his hands. They were translucent at the edges, shimmering with a faint, ghostly light. The inversion, it touched us, Thorne whispered. We aren't ghosts yet, but we aren't entirely solid either. We've become the bridge. We are the keepers of the paradox now. From the shadows of the trees at the edge of the clearing, a figure emerged. It wasn't a harvester. It was a man in tattered robes, one of the survivors from Oakhaven. He looked at Thorne and Sarah with a mixture of awe and fear. The sky is clear, the man whispered. But the whispers, they've changed. They say the Emerald City hasn't forgotten. They say they're just recalculating. Thorne stood tall, his ghostly form flickering in the moonlight. Let them calculate. Eldermurk has a way to define the math. The snow beneath Thorne's boots did not crunch. He looked down and saw his feet slightly submerged in the white powder, but the surface remained undisturbed, as if he possessed no more weight than a memory. Beside him, Sarah was staring at her own hands. They were beautiful and terrifying, laced with veins of silver light that pulsed in time with the distant, dying hum of the mountain. We saved the world, Aris, she whispered, her voice carrying an ethereal echo. But I can't feel the cold anymore. I can see the wind, but I can't feel it on my skin. What have we become? We are the side effect of a cosmic error, Thorne replied, his voice sounding like two stones grinding together deep underwater. The inversion didn't just repel the invaders. It anchored a part of their dimension inside of us. We are caught between the tick and the tock of the universe. The survivor from Oakhaven, a man named Kale, approached them warily. He stopped 10 feet away, sensing the distortion in the air around them. The Citadel is gone, Kale said, his voice trembling. The Chancellor's sacrifice took the city with it. There are clusters of us hiding in the iron valleys and the deep caves of the Whisperwood, but we are leaderless. And the sky, it's not right. Thorne looked up. The stars were there, yes, but they were shivering. Occasional ripples moved across the black velvet of space, like stones thrown into a still pond. The invaders have been pushed back, but the fabric of reality in Eldermurk have been thinned to a dangerous degree. They didn't just leave, Thorne muttered, the scientist in him struggling against the ghost he had become. They left a vacuum. And in Eldermurk, nature abhors a vacuum. Something else will try to fill it if we don't stabilize the anchor sites. We need to find the others, Sarah said, her resolve hardening despite her flickering form. If there are survivors in the Whisperwood, they might have access to the old druidic mirrors. We can use them to communicate across the continent without using the invaders' frequencies. They began their journey away from the ruined Black Needle. Walking was a strange sensation. They moved with a predatory grace, covering miles in what felt like minutes. Their ghostly state allowed them to pass through solid objects if they concentrated hard enough, though the experience left Thorne feeling nauseous and hollow. As they reached the outskirts of the Whisperwood, they saw the first signs of the static plague. In areas where the harvesters have been most active, the world had lost its color. Trees stood like gray statues, their leaves frozen in mid-fall, humming with low-level vibration that set Thorne's teeth on edge. It's a lingering dematerialization field, Thorne observed, stepping around a gray, frozen deer that looked like it had been carved from smoke. The harvest was interrupted, leaving these objects caught in a state of partial deletion. If we touch them, we might get pulled into the recycle bin of their reality. Suddenly, the gray forest erupted, not with aliens, but with phase shifters, horrific, distorted versions of forest animals that had been caught in the portal's feedback. A wolf with 3 flickering heads and fur made of static lunged at them from the gray brush. Sarah didn't reach for her pistol. She didn't need to. As the creature leapt, she instinctively raised her hand, and a wave of silver, inverted energy blasted from her palm. The wolf didn't just die. It was unwritten. It dissolved into a flurry of mathematical symbols before vanishing into the air. Sarah stared at her hand, horrified. I didn't mean to. I just thought about it stopping. The energy inside us is the same energy they use to harvest the world, Thorne said, his voice grim. We are walking weapons now. Sarah, we have to be careful. If we lose control of our emotions, we could accidentally delete the very people we're trying to save. They pushed deeper into the woods until they reached the Grove of Mirrors, an ancient site where the druids of Eldermurk had once practiced celestial navigation. There, they found a small camp of survivors. Among them was a familiar face. Miller, a junior researcher from the Aeon facility who had survived the initial breach. Dr. Thorne? Miller gasped, falling to his knees. We thought you were the first to go. But look at you, you look like them. The survivors drew back in fear, some clutching rusted blades and others holding protective charms. Thorne felt a pang of sorrow. To the world he had saved, he was now a monster, a haunting reminder of the nightmare from the stars. We aren't them, Thorne said, his voice booming with an unintended authority. We are the reason the sky is still black and not emerald. But we need your help. The invaders left behind temporal spores, these gray zones. If they aren't neutralized, they will grow until they consume Eldermurk from the inside out. How do we stop something that isn't even fully there? Miller asked. By using the mirrors to amplify our frequency, Sarah explained, stepping into the center of the grove. The silver light in her veins flared. We are the antidote. But we need to link the Grove of Mirrors to the sunken archive and the remains of Oakhaven. We need to create a new grid, a pale shield that actually works. As they prepared the ritual, the shivering stars above grew violent. A massive shadow began to blot out the moon. It wasn't a ship this time. It was a crack, a literal tear in the sky, shaped like a jagged silver lightning bolt. The invaders weren't coming back with a fleet. They were reaching to the tear with a cosmic needle, a tool designed to sew the hole Thorne had made and pull Earth back into their domain. They're trying to repair the bridge. Thorne shouted, Miller, align the mirrors. Now! The survivors scrambled to move the massive, polished stones. Thorne and Sarah took their places at the focal point as the cosmic needle descended from the tier, glowing with a heat that threatened to ignite the atmosphere. Thorne and Sarah joined hands. The contact was like a supernova. Their combined energy surged into the mirrors, shooting a beam of pure, inverted silver light straight into the tear. The forest groaned, the ancient trees leaning away from the sheer power of the blast. The silver beam met the green needle in a silent, world-shaking collision. For a moment, the two forces were balanced, order against chaos, solid against ghost. Hold it, Thorne roared, his body beginning to dissolve into pure light. Don't let them close the gap. But as the beam intensified, Thorne saw something inside the tear. Beyond the Emerald City, deeper into the alien dimension, there was something else. A flicker of something even older, even darker, that was watching the struggle with hungry eyes. The invaders were not the apex predators of the void. They were just the scouts. And by fighting them, Thorne and Sarah had just signaled the rest of the dark universe that Earth was finally ripe. Aris, something is wrong. Sarah's voice was no longer a whisper. It was a choir of echoes. The pressure, it's not coming from the Emerald City anymore. Something is pushing through from behind them. Thorne squinted into the abyss of the tier. The mathematical perfection of the harvesters, those silver-masked architects of order, was being liquidated. He saw their city, that metropolis of frozen smoke, beginning to crumble into a void that was darker than the space between stars. The harvesters weren't retreating. They were fleeing. Their cold, symphonic voices, once so arrogant, were now a discordant shriek of terror that bled through the mirrors and into the minds of survivors in the grove. The Great Unmaker has stirred. The voices lamented. The harvest was a mercy. You have opened the door to the end. A massive, multi-jointed limb, made of material that looked like solidified shadow and ancient starlight, reached through the tear. It didn't move like a machine or a creature. It moved like an idea, sudden, inevitable, and wrong. Where it touched the sky, the stars simply went out. The static plague in the forest below instantly turned from gray to a deep, devouring black. Cut the connection. Thorne yelled to Miller and the survivors. The mirrors are acting as a beacon. Shut them down. We can't, Miller cried, his hands frozen to the stone of the central mirror. The polished surface was cracking, leaking a black liquid that hissed as it touched the grass. The mirrors aren't reflecting us anymore. They're being pulled in. Thorne realized a horrific truth. Their inverted energy had successfully fought off the harvesters, but in doing so, they had acted as a tuning fork for the deep void. The primordial hunger that even advanced civilizations feared. The harvesters had wanted to harvest humanity. This new thing wanted to erase the very concept of matter. Sarah, we have to sever the ley lines manually. Thorne shouted. He looked at his own shimmering, translucent chest. The silver light was being tainted by black veins. If that thing reaches a grove, Eldermurk becomes a hole in reality. How? Sarah asked, her form flickering violently. We're barely holding ourselves together. We used the paradox one last time. We don't push the energy out. We pull the vacuum in. We have to become the seal. Thorne lunged toward the central mirror, his ghostly fingers sinking into the stone. He felt the cold of the deep void, a cold so absolute it made absolute zero feel like a summer day. It was the cold of non-existence. He reached for Sarah's hand, and as her energies merged again, he didn't aim for the sky. He aimed for the ground beneath their feet. The grove of mirrors began to spin. The survivors were thrown back by a centrifugal force of pure shadow. Thorne and Sarah became a vortex, a localized singularity of ghostly energy that began to drink the blackness pouring from the sky. You are small, a voice boomed, not in their minds, but in the marrow of their bones. It was a voice that sounded like the grinding of dead planets. You are a momentary spark in an infinite dark. Why do you struggle against the inevitable silence? Because a spark is enough to see the path. Thorne roared back. With a final, agonizing surge, they imploded. The beam of light from the mirrors snapped inward, pulling the tear in the sky down with it. The massive, shadow limb was severed as the portal collapsed, the severed portion dissolving into a rain of black ash that withered everything it touched. The explosion wasn't loud. It was a sound vacuum that sucked the noise out of the forest for miles. When the light finally faded, the grove of mirrors was gone. In its place was a perfectly circular crater of scorched, glassy obsidian. Miller and the survivors crawled to the edge of the pit. In the center lay Thorne and Sarah. They were no longer glowing. They were no longer flickering. They looked solid, but their skin was as pale as marble, and their eyes remained a haunting deep violet. Are they dead? Kale whispered, clutching the protective charm. Sarah's hand twitched. She sat up slowly, her movement stiff, like a doll being moved by invisible strings. She looked at her hands. They were solid, but she could see through them if she looked too long. They were no longer ghosts, and they were no longer human. They were the anchors. It's still there, Sarah whispered, looking up at the now empty sky. The tear is closed, but the shadow touched the world. It left something behind. Thorne stood up, his gaze fixed on the horizon. He could see things now that he couldn't see before. He saw the veins of the world, the glowing ley lines that were now turning black, infected by the void's touch. He saw that the invasion hadn't been defeated. It had simply been replaced by a slow, creeping rot. The harvesters were a fever, Thorne said, his voice now a singular, terrifying bass. But the void is a cancer, and it's spreading from the Black Needle to the Sea of Mist. What do we do now, Doctor? Miller asked, his voice full of a desperate hope that Thorne no longer felt. Thorne picked up a piece of the shattered mirror. We go to the Sea of Mist. The third key, the Aeon Gear, it didn't just break. It splintered. I can feel the fragments pulsing in the dark. If we don't gather them and forge a crown of reality, this world will finish dissolving by the next moon. He looked at Sarah. They were bound now. Two souls forged into a single shield. They were the only ones who could walk through the black zones without being erased. We are the walkers of the wounded world, Thorne declared. Gather what supplies you can. Eldermurk is dying, and we are the only ones who can teach it how to live again, even if we have to do it as monsters. As they began to march south, the shadow of the moon seemed just a little too large, and the whispers in the trees were no longer secrets, but warnings. The first encounter was over. The war for existence had just begun. The Sea of Mist was not a body of water, but a vast, low-lying basin filled with perpetual, swirling vapor that predated humanity. It was said that in Eldermurk's infancy, the stars had wept into this valley, leaving behind a fog that could show a man his greatest desire or his most agonizing regret. Now, with the Aeon Gear shattered and the void rot spreading, the mist had turned into a predatory labyrinth. Stay close to the light, Thorne commanded, his voice vibrating with a metallic resonance. He held his hand aloft, and a pale, violet flame danced above his palm, a fragment of the energy he had stolen from the portal. The mist here is no longer just a trick of the mind. It has become a medium for the Unmaker. It will try to pull you into the yesterday that it's currently consuming. Sarah walked beside him, her silver-laced skin glowing dimly. She was the more sensitive of the two. She could hear the ticking of the Aeon Gear splinters. The first shard is close, Aris. It's caught in the Anchor of Size, the old lighthouse at the center of the basin. But there's a weight in the air. Something is guarding the fracture. As they descended into the fog, the world became muffled. The footsteps of survivors behind them sounded like they were miles away, yet their breathing was as loud as a gale. Suddenly, Miller stumbled. He didn't fall onto the ground. He fell into a time well, a pocket where the mist had thinned reality. "Doctor, help!" Miller screamed. To Thorne's eyes, Miller was aging and de-aging in a frantic cycle. One moment he was a gray-haired old man, the next a crying infant. Sarah lunged forward, her ghostly hand reaching into the distortion. She didn't pull him out with physical strength. She synchronized her own flickering frequency with the well, stabilizing Miller's timeline with a surge of her silver energy. She hauled him back to solid ground, where he collapsed, gasping, his hair now streaked with permanent white. "The shards are warping everything," Sarah panted, her eyes wide. "They are trying to stitch the world back together, but they're doing it randomly. We have to gather them before the Great Unmaker finds the resonance." They reached the Anchor of Size, a towering structure of barnacle-encrusted stone that sat on a dry island in the middle of the mist. At the top of the lighthouse, where the great lamp should have been, sat a splinter of the Aeon Gear. It was a jagged crystal of golden light, spinning so fast it created a localized cyclone of chronological debris. But the lighthouse was not empty. Draped over the stone like a funeral shroud was a void sentinel, a creature born from the black ash that had fallen from the sky. It was a mass of shifting shadows, with hundreds of needle-like limbs and a single, unblinking eye that mirrored the darkness Thorne had seen beyond the tear. "The gear is a lie," the sentinel whispered, the sound vibrating in their teeth. "Time is a cage built by the weak. We offer the freedom of the void. Why do you cling to the ticking of a broken clock?" "Because the clock belongs to us," Thorne shouted. He launched himself toward the tower, his ghostly form allowing him to scale the vertical stone with gravity-defying speed. The sentinel lashed out with a shadow limb. Thorne met it with a blast of violet energy, but the blackness swallowed the fire. The creature was a sponge for energy. It thrived on the very power Thorne was trying to use. Aris, don't fight with power. Sarah yelled from below. She closed her eyes, focusing on the golden spinning shard at the top. Fight it with a paradox. Give a beginning and an end. Thorne understood. He stopped trying to blast the creature. Instead, he reached into his own core, into the cold, empty space where his heart used to be. He pulled out a memory, the memory of the Black Needle's collapse, the moment of absolute destruction and rebirth. He funneled this end-state energy into the Sentinel. The creature shrieked. A being of the eternal void could not comprehend a deadline. By forcing the concept of an ending into the Sentinel, Thorne disrupted its form. The shadow mass began to flake away like burnt paper, its limbs dissolving as it was suddenly subjected to the laws of entropy it so despised. Thorne reached the lantern room. The Aeon splinter was humming, a sound like 1,000 violins playing a single, perfect note. He didn't grab it. He allowed it to drift toward the silver veins in his arm. The shard clicked into his essence as if it were returning home. The sea of mist suddenly cleared. For a miles-wide radius, the fog vanished, revealed a graveyard of ancient ships and forgotten ruins. The survivors cheered, but Thorne stayed silent. The shard in his arm was pulsing with a map. "There are 4 more," Thorne said, landing softly beside Sarah. "The heart of the Iron Valleys, the sunken archives remains, the frozen peak of the Needle, and the last one." "Where's the last one, Aris?" Sarah asked, seeing the shadow across his face. "It's not in Eldermurk," Thorne whispered. "It's inside the Chancellor's ghost. It's at the center of the ruins of Oakhaven. But the void rot there is the strongest. It's where the Unmaker is currently building its throne." Thorne looked at his followers. They were tired, scarred, and haunted, but they were the only army reality had left. "We have the first fragment," Thorne declared, "but the Unmaker knows we are coming. From this moment on, we don't just walk through the shadows, we hunt them." As they began to move toward the Iron Valleys, the sky above Oakhaven turned a bruised, oily purple. A new sun was rising there, a sun that gave no light, only a cold, devouring hunger. "The second shard is beneath us," Thorne said, his voice a low vibration that seemed to harmonize with the groaning of the valley. He stood at the edge of the abyssal shaft, a mine that went so deep it was said to touch the roots of the world. "The Unmaker is using the Iron Heart to forge something. I can feel the heat of a furnace that doesn't burn wood, but consumes time itself." Sarah looked out over the valley. The survivors were huddled behind a ridge of slag, their faces masked with rags to filter the toxic, black dust. "The miners, they didn't all die, Aris. Look." Below them, in the flickering light of the black fire torches, figures were moving. They were the Hollowed, human miners whose spirits had been extracted by the void rot, leaving behind mindless shells of flesh and metal. Their limbs had been fused with pickaxes and shovels, and they worked in silence, digging out the void or that the Unmaker required for its dark construction. "They are building a gateway," Miller whispered, his white-streaked hair standing on end. "A permanent anchor for the shadow. We can't fight an army of the Hollowed," Sarah noted, her silver veins pulsing with an anxious light. "If we hurt them, we're just killing what's left of our people. We need to reach the heart without triggering the alarm." "I will go," Thorne decided. "My ghost walk is more stable now. I can slip through the foundations. Sarah, stay here with the survivors. If the shaft erupts, use your frequency to shield them. I need you to be the anchor if I lose my way in the dark." Thorne faded into a state of near total translucency. To the survivors, He was nothing more than a ripple in the soot-filled air. He descended into the abyssal shaft, passing through solid rock and rusted iron beams. As he went deeper, the temperature plummeted. In the iron valleys, the closer you got to the core, the colder it became. The void was drinking the heat of the planet. At the very bottom, in a chamber the size of a cathedral, Thorne found the Iron Heart. It was a massive mechanical construct of ancient Eldermurk engineering, but it had been refined. It was now encased in a shell of pulsing black glass. Suspended in the center was a second splinter of the Aeon Gear. The shard was acting as a battery, its golden light being filtered through the black glass and turned into a beam of pure negation. This beam was being fired into a pile of void ore, shaping it into a throne. Standing before the heart was a void architect, a tall, spindly entity with limbs like needles and a face that was a shifting mosaic of stolen memories. It was singing to the shard, a sound of grating metal and high-pitched static. Thorne didn't hesitate. He solidified in the center of the chamber, his violet energy erupting like a supernova in the darkness. "The song is over," he roared. The architect didn't flinch. It turned its mosaic face toward him. "Architect Thorne, you come to reclaim a piece of your cage? You do not realize that the gear was the only thing keeping the Unmaker's hunger at bay. By shattering it, you did not win. You simply removed the lock from the door. Then I'll be the new lock." Thorne lunged, his hand reaching for the black glass shell. The architect's limbs moved with impossible speed, stitching the very air around Thorne into a web of shadow. Thorne felt his ghostly form being pinned to the reality of the room. The more he struggled, the more the void rot took hold of his silver light. "You think you are a ghost?" the architect hissed. "You are just data waiting to be deleted." But Thorne wasn't alone. High above, Sarah felt the shift in the ley lines. She didn't wait for a signal. She slammed her hands into the ground of the valley, sending a pulse of sync frequency down through the Iron Heart. The vibration hit the black glass shell, creating a hairline fracture. That was all Thorne needed. He funneled the energy of the first shard, the one in his arm, into the crack. The resonance of the two pieces of the gear seeking each other was more powerful than any alien metal. The shell shattered. The second shard flew toward Thorne, clicking into his other arm. The combined power of the two shards created a shockwave that leveled the void architect and sent the hollowed miners stumbling in the tunnels above. The throne over collapsed into dust. Thorne didn't wait to celebrate. He felt the mountain beginning to groan. The Ironheart, deprived of its power source, was undergoing a catastrophic collapse. He ghost-walked upward, a streak of violet and gold light tearing through the rock. He burst out of the abyssal shaft just as the ground subsided, swallowing the foundries in a massive sinkhole. He landed beside Sarah, his chest heaving. The two shards in his arms glowed with fierce, defiant light. "Two!" Thorne panted, his violet eyes now flecked with gold. "The world felt that one," Sarah said, looking at the horizon. The bruised, purple sun over Oakhaven had grown larger. "The Unmaker is angry, Aris. It knows we have the heart." "Let it be angry," Thorne said, looking at the survivors who were now standing tall, emboldened by the victory. "We head for the sunken archive next. The third shard is in the water, and something tells me the Unmaker has sent its tide breakers to meet us." As they left the iron valleys, the rust on the machines began to flake away, revealing the clean steel beneath. It was a small victory, but in Eldermurk, even a single spark can light the way through the longest night. "The third shard is beneath the sill to the sunken archive," Sarah said, her voice shimmering with the resonance of the water. "But the tiebreakers are here, Aris. I can feel their weight on the ocean floor. They aren't just guards, they're erasers." From the depths of the black sludge, massive shapes began to rise. These were the Tide Breakers, leviathans of the void, resembling skeletal whales constructed from obsidian ribs and glowing violet nerves. They didn't breathe air, they breathed entropy. As they breached the surface, the mist around them simply ceased to exist, leaving behind a terrifying, empty vacuum. "The survivors can't come any further," Thorne commanded, looking back at Miller and the others. "The atmospheric pressure alone will crush a mortal lung. Stay at the ridge. If we don't return, take the remaining ley line maps and hide in the deep caves. Do not look back." Thorne and Sarah stepped onto the liquid surface. Because of their ghostly state, they didn't sink. They glided across the sludge like oil on water. As they approached the spire of the sunken archive, the Tide Breakers let out a subsonic roar that made the very air vibrate with the frequency of decay. The shards of the debris of a failed reality. The collective mind of the Tide Breakers boomed. Why gather the pieces of a broken mirror? The void is the only perfect surface. One of the leviathans lunged, its massive jaw opening to reveal a throat that was a literal tunnel into the nothingness. Thorne didn't dodge. He raised both arms. The two shards of the Aeon Gear flared with a blinding, golden light. He created a chronos shield, a barrier made of compressed time. The leviathan slammed into it, its obsidian body shattering against the sheer density of 1,000 years packed into a single inch of space. "Sarah, now!" The archive floor. Thorne shouted, holding the shield against the other two approaching monsters. Sarah dived into the black sludge. Below the surface, the sunken archive was being dismantled by void parasites, small, flickering entities that were eating the history out of the books. In the center of the ruins, glowing with a desperate, dying light, was the third shard, the Chronos Anchor. As Sarah's hand closed around the shard, the Tide Breakers went into a frenzy. They realized that if the three shards were united, the Unmaker's hold on Eldermurk's timeline would begin to slip. They converged on Thorne, their bodies merging into a single colossal wave of black negation. "Aris!" Sarah screamed, bursting from the sludge, the third shard glowing in her hand. Thorne was being overwhelmed. The blackness was seeping into his violet aura, turning his ghostly form into a bruised, flickering shadow. But as Sarah reached him and pressed the third shard into his chest, a transformation occurred. The three shards didn't just sit in his body. They merged. Thorne was no longer a man or a ghost. He became a living event. His body expanded into a pillar of golden and violet light that pierced the oily clouds of the marshes. The Tide Breakers were caught in the light and instantly reverted. Their obsidian forms turned back into the harmless sea mist they had been before the void touched them. The sea of mist began to flow again. The dead time shards melted into harmless water. The sunken archive, though still in ruins, felt clean. Thorne stood on the water, his form now solid gold, his eyes twin singularities of infinite time. He looked toward the north, toward the black sun of Oakhaven. 3. Thorne's voice was now the voice of the world itself. The 4th is at the frozen peak. The 5th is in the throne. We have the momentum. Sarah, the Unmaker is no longer hunting us. It is preparing its defense. Sarah looked at him with a mixture of love and terror. "Aris, how much of you is left in there?" Thorne looked at his hands, which were now etched with the complex fractals of the Aeon Gear. "Enough to remember why we started this, but not enough to fear the end." They turned toward the Black Needle, where the 4th shard, the splinter of the mountain's soul, awaited them. The final battle for the heart of Eldermurk was drawing near, and sky was beginning to bleed gold. The Black Needle did not resemble a mountain anymore. It was a jagged tooth of absolute zero, surrounded by a swirling storm of oblivion frost. This was not ice made of water. It was the cold of a universe where the stars had gone out. Thorne and Sarah stood at the base, their forms radiant against the oppressive dark. Behind them, the few remaining survivors stayed back, their torches extinguished by a wind that blew from the beginning of time. "The fourth shard is at the very tip of the needle," Thorne said, his voice now a resonance that shook the frost from the air. "It is the Glacier of Memory. It holds the blueprint of Eldermurk's physical form. If the Unmaker corrupts it, the very earth beneath our feet will turn into a shadow." "I can feel it, Aris," Sarah whispered, her silver veins now shimmering with a golden hue. "But the climb, the air is thinning into non-existence. Every step we take, we are leaving the world behind." They began the ascent. Gravity was a dying law here. They walked up the vertical faces of the black rock, their boots leaving glowing imprints on the frozen stone. As they climbed, they passed the echo husks, the frozen forms of scientists and soldiers who had been caught in the first explosion. They weren't dead. They were trapped in the exact millisecond of their destruction, their faces twisted in eternal surprise. Halfway to the summit, the Void Stalkers appeared. These were the elite guards of the Unmaker, born from the deepest recesses of the Emerald City's fallen shadows. They were tall, spindly, and carried blades of null light. They didn't speak. They moved with a horrific, stuttering speed, flickering in and out of the frost. "Go, Sarah," Thorne roared, his chest glowing as the three shard within him sought their sibling. "I will hold the ridge. Reach the peak and claim the glacier." Thorne engaged the stalkers. It was a battle of metaphysical proportions. Every time a null blade struck his chronos shield, a shockwave of gold and black energy rippled across the mountain, causing massive avalanches of dead time. Thorne fought not with steel, but with the very fabric of history. He aged the stalkers into dust, then de-aged the dust into nothingness. Sarah reached the summit. There, embedded in the final jagged spike of the mountain, was the Glacier of Memory. It was a diamond of pure, blinding white light, containing the data pulse of every tree, stone, and soul in Eldermurk. Standing over was a vain entity, its body now entirely composed of black, oily wires and violet fire. "You cannot save a world that has already been forgotten, Sarah," it hissed, its voice a corruption of her old mentor's tone. "The Unmaker has already begun the final tally. Oakhaven is the end. This shard is just a souvenir. It's more than that," Sarah cried, her hand reaching into the freezing white light of the glacier. "It's the anchor that brings us home." As her fingers touched the crystal, the vain entity lunged, but Sarah didn't flinch. She allowed the glacier's power to flow through her, using her own anchor, nature, to channel the memory of the world. The entity shrieked as the pure, uncorrupted history of Eldermurk burned through its void shell. The black wires melted, and the entity dissolved into a flurry of static before vanishing into the wind. Sarah grabbed the fourth shard. The mountain let out a tectonic roar. The oblivion frost shattered. Thorne appeared beside her, his golden form now so bright it was hard to look upon. The four shards, the sea, the heart, the archive, and the glacier, revolve around him like a miniature solar system. "We have the blueprint," Thorne said, looking toward the horizon. There, in the distance, Oakhaven was no longer a city. It had become a void pyramid, a massive structure of black glass reaching miles into the sky. At its apex sat the black sun, and within its throne room, the Great Unmaker was preparing the final deletion. "The fifth shard," Sarah said, her voice steady now. "It's inside the Chancellor's ghost, at the very center of that pyramid." "Then we end this," Thorne declared, "not as men, not as ghosts, but as the world's last line of code." The march to Oakhaven was no longer a march. It was a crusade of light. Thorne and Sarah flew across the blighted plains, a twin-tailed comet of gold and silver. As they reached the base of the void pyramid, the reality around them began to dissolve. The ground turned into mathematical grids. The trees became wireframe ghosts. The Unmaker was turning Eldermurk into raw data. They entered the pyramid. The interior was a hall of infinite mirrors. each reflecting a version of the world that was being erased. In the center of the great hall, sitting upon a throne of obsidian and bone, was a Great Unmaker, a being of the deep void that had no true form, only a shifting silhouette of cosmic hunger. And beside the throne stood the ghost of the Chancellor. He wasn't a prisoner, he was the battery. The fifth shard, the soul key, was embedded in his chest, its white light being turned into the black fuel that powered the pyramid. Architects, the Unmaker's voice boomed, a sound that felt like the collapse of 1,000 suns. You bring the pieces of the puzzle back to the box. How convenient. Once I consume the four you carry, the archive of Earth will be complete, and I shall move on to the next star. You won't consume anything, Thorne said, stepping forward. He looked at the Chancellor's ghost. Chancellor, remember Oakhaven. Remember the ley lines. The world is not data. It is blood and stone and memory. The Chancellor's eyes flickered. For a second, the white light in his chest flared, resisting the black wires. The Unmaker shrieked, its shadow limbs lashing out to crush the rebellion. Sarah, the final plan. Thorne yelled. They didn't attack the Unmaker. Instead, they stood on either side of the Chancellor. Thorne and Sarah began to spin their energies in opposite directions, one representing the infinite past, the other the infinite future. We are the paradox, they shouted in unison. They forced the four shards into the Chancellor's chest, merging them with the fifth. The result was a big bang in a bottle. The pyramid began to implode. The black glass shattered as the uncorrupted energy of all five shards united, creating a system restore on a planetary scale. The Unmaker shrieked as its void form was subjected to the rules of existence. It couldn't exist in a world that was perfectly balanced. It began to evaporate, its shadows being burned away by the dawn of the five shards. Aris, the world is returning. Sarah cried as she saw the green forest and blue skies bleeding back into the wireframe grid. But the cost was absolute. To stabilize the restoration, the five shards needed a permanent anchor. They needed a consciousness to hold the frequency forever. I'll stay, the Chancellor's voice echoed, now clear and calm. I am already a ghost of the old world. I will be the guardian of the anchor. Go, Aris. Go, Sarah. Take what's left of humanity and build something that doesn't need to peek into the void. With a final surge of light, the void pyramid vanished. Thorne and Sarah woke up on the grassy hills overlooking the valley of Oakhaven. The sun was rising, a real sun, warm and golden. The Black Needle Mountain was a distant, peaceful peak. They looked at each other. Their skin was no longer glowing. Their eyes were human again. The shards were gone, anchored forever in the foundation of Eldermurk. They were human once more, but they would always remember the cold of the stars. And so, the harvest was averted, and the shadows were cast back into the deep. But Eldermurk is a land that never truly forgets its scars. If you found yourself captivated by this descent into cosmic horror and the resilience of the human spirit, make sure to subscribe to our chronicles, like this journey to signal the other survivors, and comment below. Would you have taken the ghost walk to save your world? Or would you have let the harvest begin? Stay vigilant, stay curious, and never stop looking into the dark. We will meet again in the halls of Eldermurk.